of British Literature and Culture at Liverpool Hope University. Mostly worked on literature in the 20th century poets, of which Edward Thomas is a keen favourite, one of your favourites, up there with the rest of them. And again, has been involved in this festival from the very start. Knows many of the individuals who are in this room today and has definitely helped shape where we are today. So it's a great pleasure for you to be back again. And without further ado, without boring anyone any more from me, I'll hand you over to Guy. But enjoy. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hello. Yes, sorry for not being here all day, but because of teaching, I had to come down today from near Liverpool, so I spent most of the day on the road in the lovely weather. So I hope you've had loads of amazing events today. And I am the late night last act. You are a late night crowd, you can heckle, throw beer cans at me, and I'm supposed to do dirty jokes or something, aren't I, to keep you entertained. I was trying to drop off to sleep after this wonderful day of Thomasy stuff. But we're going to talk about teaching, I think. Something that's obviously on my mind as the teaching term kicks off again. But also, it's just interesting to think about two things. Thomas's thoughts about teaching. It's a very clever boy. He was obviously very good at doing things like school and university, but who nonetheless has lots of opinions about school and university hidden away in his work. But then also a little bit to think about Thomas in the classroom and having to teach him and how students might react to him as well. I don't have a huge amount of time, so I apologise if I am rambling left, right, and backwards and forwards, but we'll do my best. And I've got some slides to at least give you some words to look at as I'm talking, but hopefully this is a chance to think about Thomas and the classroom from two different points of view. Good, so I used as the title a reference to these lines in Lob by Thomas, which you'll see is this unusual word, unteach. If ever a sage troubles him, he will buzz like a beehive to conclude the tedious fray, and the sage who knows all languages runs away. Yet Lob has 1,300 names for a fool, and though he never could spare time for school to unteach what the fox so well expressed, on biting the cock's head off, quietness is best. He can talk quite as well as anyone after his thinking is forgot and done. You notice, of course, as well, that fool and school rhyme together in those lines, which is quite appropriate sometimes for thinking about how Thomas thinks about school. And it's not very complimentary lines about the concept of school here either. This sense that school is taking something away rather than necessarily actually giving you something. It's unteaching something that is naturally there. So Thomas falls into, in these lines at least, that rather romantic idea of a belief in natural wisdom or nature as an education, skepticism about classrooms and the school curriculum, and maybe the sense that school is not focusing on the kind of learning that Thomas himself particularly appreciated or tried to impart to his own children. And that very interesting word, unteach, I guess interpreted in different ways, but the sense of taking something away, as well as that implication of being untaught. You can think very interestingly about all the unwords in Edward Thomas anyway. If you start thinking about your Edward Thomas poems now, think about how important those words with the un prefix to them are in Thomas. But anyways, maybe that means then, in some contexts, might think about the word untaught, never having received an education, or having some knowledge taken away or corrected or removed. Maybe that's part of the role of school and university, to correct things that you thought you already knew. But also then that sense of the more positive sense of being untaught, perhaps, where something is instinctively known. Might praise someone for being an untaught piano player, perhaps they're just a natural at it. That word natural comes out when you think about being untaught or unteaching as well. And is teaching about taking away the natural, even though it's such a positive term normally in Thomas in the way that he thinks about the world. So, what you will find in Thomas then is the references from time to time which do suggest that rather romantic idea, maybe that there is wisdom in being untaught, there is maybe something preferable in the world of a lob, perhaps. There are things that people who are untaught, things that they know more or better than those who have been through formal education, and also a sense maybe of something mysterious about the instinctive or the untaught person. Quote here from his essay, story Helen. At school she learned only to fear school teachers and lofty rooms with shiny pictures. All her wisdom was in the quickness of her feet and the light of her eyes. Or in Richard Jefferies, the idea of the wisdom of the unlearned. Indeed, even with that word, of course, there is a sense of, does it mean people who have not received an education at all, or those who've had their education taken away or corrected? That word, unteach. And you might go all the way back to thinking about the kind of history of literature and ideas of the noble savage or something like that, this sense that we can find some way of admiring people who've never had an education, feeling that they know more or something different, something that's been lost by those people who've been through education, if you want to put it in those terms. So you go all the way back to Dryden, perhaps as an example, and see he uses that word unteach. We by art unteach what nature taught, he says there at the last line on that screen. And there's certainly part of that in Thomas, that scepticism then about whether we actually almost lose more by going to school than we actually gain. That school, or indeed university, becomes some kind of prison that we need to escape from, that maybe self-education is preferable. And when you look at Thomas's childhood and life, there's always been an element in him of preferring the world outside school or self-education. Talks very much about educating himself by escaping into the countryside when he's a boy in London, for instance, and meeting people who become more important as teachers, perhaps, than the people in the classroom. So Daduzzle, for instance, old men of the land, part of inspirations for Lob, I suppose, who can educate him things that he's not going to learn in the classroom, and which actually maybe are more important to him or more valuable. Or indeed, you could look at the Happy-Go-Lucky Morgans, which is Thomas's one novel, which is got very strong autobiographical elements to it, where Thomas looks back at his own childhood and also to fictionalize and create this wonderful family, the Morgans, who are keen readers, but represent a rejection of learning and culture as well, a rejection of school and the restrictions it places upon young people. We're told about, for instance, the Morgan sons, and the main character, just one of those sons, Philip, knows meadows in the grounds which their owners never used at night. And in our country, Philip and I spent really a great deal of time fishing, birds nesting, and trying to shoot birds with crossbow, pistol, or homemade gun. There were intervals of school and of football and cricket, but these in memory do not amount to more than the towns of England do in comparison with the country. As on the map, the towns are but blots and spots on the country, so the school hours were embedded, almost buried away in the holidays, official, semi-official, and altogether unofficial. So very much this celebration of the world beyond school, getting out of school, and school itself really not being an important part of the education of these young men, or indeed of Edward Thomas himself, perhaps. He talks too about two of the other boys in the story, Jack and Roland. Jack and he had been to a famous school until they were 16 and did no good there. Indoors they learned very little more than a manner extremely well suited to hours of idleness. Out of outdoors, they excelled at the more selfish sports, at athletics, boxing, sculling, shooting. So they had come home, and as Mr. Morgan had nothing to suggest, they had done what suggested itself. And some kind of aberration in Thomas for these boys who have no interest in indoor life, and it's very much their education is outdoors. Thomas himself didn't quite get given this sense of freedom, of course, and the father, Mr. Morgan, after Morgan, is not really like Thomas's own father. He was very keen that Thomas should do well in school and should get through his exams and get on in life. But there is this desire, this aberration to be the kind of boy who leaves his education for the outdoors. And actually it's interesting that Thomas writes this story that happened to Morgan's about young boys, about growing up in London, and yet school doesn't really feature at all in the story. It's not a Victorian school story at all, and think of all the Victorian school stories of the time about boarding school, and so Thomas doesn't go anywhere near that. You don't really learn anything about what goes on inside a school building. It's entirely the life beyond school and outside school that matters. And of course, bear in mind, there was an element of that in Thomas too, although he was a good schoolboy in a sense. He was also someone who always felt he didn't quite fit in school, felt himself as a bit of an outsider, famously declared, "I love birds more than books" as well when he was a schoolboy. So there was always a sense that his own affections were not quite those that the schoolmasters would have wanted. And you can see in the South Country as well that Thomas then thinks about the idea of teaching outside the classroom. So we're talking about the difference between indoor teaching and outdoor teaching, perhaps. That those boys, that local Morgan's boys, are getting their education outdoors, doing sport and rambling around in the countryside, and completely ignoring indoor life. But what about that time when education may well go outdoors and become some form of nature study, which Thomas takes actually quite a lot of interest in the South Country. It's quite an extended discussion of nature teaching, as he calls it, in the South Country, which is one of the few moments when Thomas really starts talking like he is writing for some kind of educational publication about how we should teach today, that kind of thing. If you can't quite see it, that's probably quite small font on the screen. I'll read it out anyway. What is to come of our nature teaching in schools? What does it aim at? Whence does it arise? In part, no doubt, it is due to our desire to implant information. It is all very well for the poet to laugh when science has discovered something more. We shall be happier than we were before. But that is the road we are on at a high rate of speed. If we are fortunate, we shall complete our inventory of the contents of heaven and earth by the time when the last man or woman wearing the last pair of spectacles has decided that, after all, it is a very good world and one which is quite possible to live in. So Thomas's anti-spectacles bias coming through there, I think. And I believe his daughter Navalny had that, didn't she? There's a little bit in the letters where she doesn't like people who wear glasses. That, however, is an end which would not in itself be a sufficient inducement to push on towards it. Still less can such a vision have set us upon the road. Joy through knowledge on a foundation of health is what we appear to seek. So Thomas is not quite saying let's kind of burn down the school and reject all forms of knowledge, but he's highly skeptical about nature teaching that's entirely about facts and entirely about science. Again, that tends to be where nature teaching has gone in the classroom and in the curriculum these days. It's interesting that, as you might know, there's now GCSE in natural history, but the government insisted that literature could not play a part in it, and it has to be entirely seen as a science GCSE and not an arts and culture one. So we are in an age where natural history is seen as something for the sciences, which Thomas himself was pushing back against over 100 years ago. But he's not entirely saying that we shouldn't be learning stuff. He's also, of course, aware that nature teaching and nature learning is, in the time he was writing, not always indeed something that was ever actually done outside. So frequently it was people teaching it in a classroom as if it was Latin or anything else. or it was often seen as a filler class. There's a bit in D.H. Lawrence's letters where he talks about when he's teaching in Croydon and the boys are taking nature study, and all they've done is learn, I think, how to make a Christmas pudding and then eat it at the end of the course, and that was their nature class. And I suspect that was probably not unusual for many schools. They don't let the boys outdoors at all because they're just going to cause trouble, so keep them indoors. They can do some cooking, or they can look at some pictures of birds and books, but they're not going to get outside. It's interesting that Thomas talks there wonderfully as well about having a professor of felicity. It'd be a nice thing to be, wouldn't it? Perhaps nature herself will aid. Her presence will certainly make for felicity by enlarging her pupil for a time from the cloistered life which modern towns and their infinite conveniences and servitudes encourage. So there's this sense maybe that there's a form of education that can be an antidote to modern life. So we shouldn't just see education as part of modern life, which is a bad thing, but actually see education as some kind of cure or solution or salve. And then he references Tolstoy in that context too, talking indeed about Tolstoy's walks on a winter night with his pupils chatting and telling tales is something of Thomas's idea perhaps of what an ideal education would be, and not the kind of education that Thomas himself experienced growing up in London. He says the interesting phrase there, says, leaves an impression of electrical activity and felicity in the young and old minds of that party which is hardly to be surpassed. An impression of electrical activity and felicity. Wonderful way of thinking about education there in a different sense. Of course, that might lead you then to think about Bedales, because of course, although Thomas himself doesn't go there, he sends his children there and his wife works there, and Bedales does fit into a tradition of progressive education trying to offer something different. It's much easier to offer something different as well if you're in the countryside rather than in London. And you could think in terms of Bedales about a scepticism to some extent about books and bookishness, and indeed a desire to get outdoors as much as possible, without quite at the same time rejecting education full stop. There's still a need to learn and to be in the classroom. It's not anti-education. But there's always that interesting tension in progressive schools anyway. The progressive and the school bit are always quite a lot in tension because should you really need books at all or learning indoors at all? How much time should you spend outside? How much time is there to be learned outdoors before you come back in and do something with it, writing it down and so on? And nonetheless, these schools, such as Bedales, also want to celebrate writing and literature and the arts as well. But Thomas consciously then chooses a school which might fit with some of that scepticism about education and schools that he expressed there in Law. And just a few references then from J.H. Badlin's Bedales, a Pioneer School, which at least emphasise some wariness about being too bookish. Or being too abstract, as he says there too. This sense maybe of learning through doing, this experiential education, experiential learning, which is becoming quite a common thing for people to think about these days, even if they don't necessarily put it into action very much. It's almost as if law could be the kind of Bedales product, I suppose. Someone who gets a natural wisdom from spending his time outdoors in the Hampshire countryside rather than in the classroom. Speaking, not writing, making, not talking. And then Thomas in early 1914 is writing a fiction that doesn't actually get published, it's just called fiction, which has now partly been published in the book of Thomas's autobiographies in the Thomas's prose series, where there's this wonderful description, quite an extended description of a school teacher, which captures quite a lot of what we've been talking about. So we've been talking about ideas of education here, but now maybe we should think more about the teacher as well, and how teachers get portrayed in Thomas's work. They don't get portrayed very often, but when they do, it's never very positively. And of course, we should bear in mind that for someone from Thomas's background and someone bookish like himself, there's always that worry about having to become a teacher, that you might end up as a teacher, and he's at different points in his life tried to resist taking that path or ending up that way. And he portrays a teacher here who's a bit odd, I suspect, as well as someone who feels he's been trapped in a profession of a kind. Thomas talks in his fiction as well about being a teenager. It's basically another portrait like Happy Go Lucky Morgan's about being a teenage boy, where school again is considered as something that is at best unimportant. Talks there about school no longer troubled me, and how the best way to get through school is to just get your work done and then forget about it and get on with your life that exists beyond the classroom. And he has an encounter with the headmaster, and he's about to leave school actually, and the headmaster calls him over to talk to him. Gives him a lesson, which is basically like saying don't become a school teacher, basically. It's an interesting little moment in the story that the headmaster kind of gives him a word of warning against education. I've put up just an extract from it there, but maybe I'll read a little bit more than just the extract. At the end of that year, I was saying goodbye to the headmaster before leaving school for an office. We had some conversation, and somehow we discovered that we had both been at the same seaside place in the last holidays. And he says, oh no, I'm not going to give you advice about girls in particular, as it happens. You're a man now, and I am only a schoolmaster. Interesting distinction there. There's men and the schoolmasters. I was getting impatient and uncomfortable. When he really began, I can't think he was really talking to me, saying things like this: I am old. I began to feel my skeleton inside me when I was 30, just as if it has already begun to be covered over with earth instead of flesh and skin. As he drew his hand over his face, he said, this is the kind of thing you find on the beach at Dunwich, where the old churchyard tips out its rubbish after a high tide. I am beginning to make a skeleton, the headmaster says. And of course, some of you will know that Thomas lived out at Dunwich and spent some time picking bones off the beach where the old church there had been falling into the sea. So Thomas is thinking very specifically about a particular moment when he himself started having thoughts about mortality as he's picking bones off the beach. I'm beginning to make a skeleton. It is all I ever shall make. No children, except, of course, that, as the poet says, the child is father. That is not the kind of begetting I am thinking of. Here he laughed violently, but I was not at all amused. I don't know how it's done, he says. I remember him saying, although I am a schoolmaster, but to succeed in life you must avoid being what I am. I just think that back, says, I don't know how it's done. I think he's saying, I don't know how to make children, I think. And it's a bit of an odd conversation to have with a boy. There we go. I think he's saying, I don't know how babies are made. I am a schoolmaster, but to succeed in life, you must avoid being what I am. You must not become a sheath for a skeleton at 30 and be what I am at 40. I'm not a skeleton now, I am a skull mounted on stilts, a sort of lighthouse where the brain or light, such as it is everything. I carry this skull about because it is a box containing my means of livelihood. My legs merely join it to the ground and my arms to the food I eat. I am a lighthouse with no how dim a light post at the top. The rest is nothing now, but I want to love, the teacher says. Very odd conversation. This is where the boy would be backing out the room. I want to love, he says. Once only I was loved, and I could not love back again. I have been starved ever since. I have been at this school 20 years, and every day of those years I have made myself tired. I used to say that someday I would rest, slack off, look round, smoke a pipe again, drink red wine, raise my voice out of doors, not to bully the boys, but for pleasure, get about over rough country with dogs. So this kind of wonderful sense that, again, there's a perfect entrapment here. The school teacher's trapped in the school and wants to be outside hanging out with dogs and drinking wine and seducing women or whatever. But also that his brain is this kind of image of a brain in a box, and all he is knowledge walking around on a stick, basically. And his wonderful word of warning to the boy that don't become just a brain in a box. Have a life, be outdoors, don't worry about education. I thought perhaps I should forget the snap of my heel joints as I walk and the creak of my neck as I lie in bed at night. I should cease to sigh, and perhaps I should be ripe instead of dry. I should have something in store. I should not dare to look at the Venus and I'm going to have to get that pronunciation, and at the Yemeni, or even the Amazons fighting the centaurs. In other words, going to the art gallery and looking at pictures. I should be able to love, he says. If only I was capable of awakening love. And then starts talking to him about the boy, but I saw you with a girl. I saw you with a dark girl. You should love. He says to the boy, as he's leaving, love women, be loved by women. God bless you and forgive me. And that's the end of his speech. The end of his No teacher at school ever said that to me. Love women, be loved by women. God bless you and forgive me. Of course, the boy is horribly unnerved by this and actually quite embarrassed and thinks, what a weirdo. But takes the lesson on board that life is to be lived beyond the world of books and the classroom, and that beyond the world of the office as well, and that life is somehow an outdoor thing, and that he needs to now go off and fall in love. He says about the teacher, once having escaped from all that ill-adorned skeleton, I felt less the pity of it and more the disgust. My pity was in fact only the first stage of contempt, and the experience taught me nothing of men, and told me just this of one solitary middle-aged man, one whom for 10 years I had treated half with fear, half with mockery, that he had once been amorous and was still amorous thoughted, as no middle-aged man should be, outside poetry, and certainly no grey, puckered and hollowed-out man like this schoolmaster. No sympathy for schoolmasters at all. No sympathy for him. He was just an embarrassment, and how dare he have amorous thoughts. Amorous thoughted, as no middle-aged man should be. So there you are. Wonderful kind of amusing bit of Thomas, and indeed a slight difference from a lot of Thomas's writing, to bear in mind that there is this comic side, but he's also been quite serious, I think, in terms of his attitude to teaching and learning sometimes. And you might even think with Thomas, what are the uses of a university education? What he does say in the South Country, the book we mentioned earlier, is I've read a great deal of history. In fact, a university gave me a degree out of respect for my apparent knowledge of history. But I've forgotten it all. Or it has got into my blood and is present in me in a form which defies evocational analysis. But as far as I can tell, I am pure of history. And again, I kind of you'd say that's a positive thing, that's a good education, because it's not something he's even aware of, maybe it's embedded in him. But there is this sense that he's really conforming with certain kind of Tory ideas that maybe what his history degree is a waste of time, perhaps, because it's completely useless for Thomas as far as he can see, that his life is not one that's using his degree, and indeed he can't even remember anything about it. And when he talks in the South Country as well about what he's done with his life, walking around places like this, and actually kind of spending time with country people as opposed to townspeople, and then makes reference to his trade, and refers to writing as an unskilled labourer and not a trade. And maybe again, slightly joking, another unword there as well, the prefix unskilled labour. But there is a sense for him maybe that he thinks that his career that he's taken as a writer is not really directly related to the education he received. We talk all the time now in universities and schools about employability and career focus on your using transferable skills and all of that. But Thomas doesn't think about himself being a writer as being someone who's grown out of his education, or that he's learned a skill or a profession at school and university. He's doing an unskilled labour, almost as if he needn't have had an education at all. And you can then think about his book on Walter Pater in that context. Walter Pater was an Oxford Don, So very much a representative, despite being unusual in Oxford, he was nonetheless a representative of an Oxford education. Thomas in that book doesn't necessarily reject Pater, but he's certainly sceptical about various aspects of Pater's writing and thinking, and maybe about education itself. Even when Thomas wrote a book about Oxford in 1903, it's interesting how little of it is actually about teaching and learning. And the most powerful bits in Thomas's book about Oxford are the bits about gardens and the countryside around Oxford, rather than anything that actually goes on in the classroom. And when he talks about Pater as well, he's suspicious of people who, if you like, show off their learning. And the unnaturalness, perhaps, that goes hand in hand with an education. Maybe the more you get educated, the more you move away from that naturalness that we began with when we talked about law. And that worry that people are acquiring their knowledge through books rather than from that outdoor life that we already referenced. Or indeed thinking about language even as well. And Thomas talks there about the language of the unlearned, again going back to that word unlearned, like the word idea of being untaught. And there's even almost a sense in Thomas in the book on Pater that he's certainly thinking about the idea of almost unteaching himself certain forms of writing, certain forms of speaking, and moving away from certain types of using your knowledge or using your learning in your writing. And that might even come down to choice of words. Mike talks there about Herrick and says, Herrick used scores of words known to him as a university man, and only to be understood by the light today. Few of these are to be found in those poems which are now thought best, even by university men. So there's this sense that you might know loads of words, but then take Herrick as an example. There's a sense that him shedding that knowledge when it comes to writing his best poetry. You can think about that direction that Thomas himself might be taking as he moves towards becoming a poet himself. Or indeed you could think about what Thomas says about John Clare in that context, and part of it being a connection here in these lines with the idea of childhood. So there's almost like a desire in Thomas, or indeed for all poets, to go back to being a child and thinking and viewing the world like a child, and there's some elements of that in his own poetry when you think about it, which might be a way of moving almost backwards to the point before you receive an education as being the ideal state. Thinking about how children play with words before they're taught them, play with words before they're forced to give them a specific meaning or a specific use. The magic of words is due to their living freely among things, and no man knows how they came together in just the order when a beautiful thing is made like full fathom fire. And so it is that children often make phrases that are poetry, though they still more often produce it in their acts and half-suggested thoughts. So Thomas is, again, almost trying to bypass school here, thinking about what creativity might be. Similar ideas could be seen in what he says about J.M. Synge as well. The need to move beyond, or backwards maybe even, like if that's the right name to, if that's the right way of thinking about it. Bookishness, going away from bookishness, thinking about naturalness of speech, whatever that might necessarily actually be. By nature or by art, we must achieve a speech, something like hit this, which corresponds with the thought almost onomatopoeically, or fail. Quite unbookish phrases, he says there. So then, now we're 20 minutes left. You might want to then start thinking about Thomas then moving towards becoming a poet himself. And think about maybe this idea of being untaught in the context of Thomas's poetry and indeed the context of the classroom. It is interesting to think about how Thomas sometimes does get associated with this idea of maybe either being untaught or at least being something about it, under unprefix, unpoetic as a concept sometimes applied to Thomas, for instance, such as John Powell Ward's book, The English Line Poetry of the Unpoetic, from Wordsworth to Larkin, or Walter Delamere talking about Thomas and saying that, like every other individual writer, he had unlearned all literary influences. So there is some sense of Thomas by the time he's in his 30s and beginning to write poetry at the age of 36, having reached a state where he's shed his education, that he's unlearned things and shed some kind of knowledge that he doesn't really need or want, or which would actually make him a better writer. I don't know. I mean, it's impossible to say exactly where poetry comes from or what creates it in that context, but it's very interesting to think about the way Thomas is thinking and speaking at the point when he takes up poetry. Or indeed, in April 1914, just before the First World War, commenting that he would like 5 years free from reading or writing about books. The occupation turns country into town. I'm going to Carmarthenshire for a week or two after Easter with my 2 elder children who will keep me free from books. There's that desire somehow to be unbookish. Although actually the First World War, of course, when it does come, does push Thomas back into the realms of teaching and learning in other contexts, because first of all, there's the possibility that he might become a teacher by lecturing in America. There's that possibility of him escaping the war by going back to America with Frost and becoming a teacher for the first time in his life, but he worries about whether he's up to it. There's a possibility of Thomas teaching in a school in England. He goes to Babelais School to speak to a friend there at one point in June 1915. And then when he joins the Artist Rifles, he then becomes a form of teacher, although it's a form of teacher that takes him also back to what we were seeing earlier with the discussion of nature teaching, because Thomas is doing things like teaching map reading and orienteering, so he's in a sense teaching outside the classroom as well as in it. It's at that point as well that one of his pupils, if that's what they could be called, is probably Wilfred Owen, another teacher, as it happens. Can't go into Wilfred Owen now, but he's got a lot to say about teaching as well. So what do we say then about Thomas when we get to the classroom and think about that idea of unlearning and unteaching? Well, there is obviously evidence of Thomas's learning in his work, and there's no denying that. Elusiveness, direct references to other writers and thinkers, sense of Thomas's knowledge of history, despite him saying that he's pure of history. There is also, though, a difference between, say, Thomas's writing, of course, and that of something like Eliot's The Wasteland. And in some ways, it's easier to teach The Wasteland than it is to teach, say, The Wasp Trap, if you want to compare The Wasp Trap with The Wasteland, because students know what to do with The Wasteland. You can find out the quotations, you can look at the notes, you can unpick the complexity. But how do you, as a student, go about talking about a poem like The Wasp Trap? There might be a tendency to automatically complicate it by trying to say, oh, this is symbolic of something. Well, in a way, The Wasp Trap is symbolic, because Thomas talks about it as a star at the end of the poem. But its simplicity, of course, is its power and its importance, which can actually make it quite hard to talk about or write about. You might think of other writers for whom that might be the case as well, or at least some who like to think they were like that. Philip Larkin would be a good example. Larkin said that I think in one sense I'm like Evelyn Waugh or John Betjeman, in that there's not much to say about my work. When we've read a poem, that's it. It's all quite clear what it means. I'm not sure that's quite true, of course, and it's certainly not true about Edward Thomas, but there is some senses when you're confronted with The Wasp Trap that you might think, well, where do we go with this? What do we say about it? There's no footnotes with it that will be obviously part of the poem in the way that they are with The Wasteland, which comes with its own footnotes. There will be lots of footnotes you could add to it as part of your classroom talk. But what we try and resist, of course, is the idea that Thomas is not saying what he's saying. That Thomas is writing in a hidden meaning or a code all the time. The wasp trap is not just a wasp trap, or the tree is not a tree, or the sky is not a sky. or that it's about the war, or all of these things. And this is where the problem comes with teaching Thomas, I find. But also where the strength of it comes. It can be quite a shock to students sometimes for you to tell them, well, maybe just enjoy it in itself, rather than seeing it as a code or a hidden meaning or something to unpick. That comes through with things like war poetry, because of course there are some poems such as these which can easily be interpreted as war poems in different senses, not necessarily entirely about the war, but certainly the wars in them. But the phrase war poet or soldier poet immediately makes the students want to see everything in the poem about war, as if the poem only exists to be a war poem, the only thing that's valuable is that it's a commentary on war. There are also some critics who will go further and make readings of coded elements in the poems that make them more war poetry than we'd even know. I think an example might be in The Owl when Tom Paulin sees the word Hun in the word hungry. I mean, I can't prove that either way. I mean, I don't know, but I mean, that is a desire to see it as more of a war poem than it would at the first reading be. He also sees the word Hun in the word unable as well. My restriction a little bit, dropping your H's. There's fun in that, but of course, if you're not careful, you get possibly quite far away from the poem itself and what Thomas might have meant. One example of that actually is the poem Rain, which frequently in student essays you see described as a poem about trenches. As you know, it was written before Thomas went out to France, and he's never a trench poet in that sense anyway. It's frequently students think of it as him being on the Western Front. That's not helped by the fact that there are critics who've made that mistake too. There's a professor at Oxford who I was reading recently who says that Thomas loved rain, and when he was in France in the trenches, one of the poems he wrote then was about the sound of the rain and how it made him feel like he was back home. And that's a professor of literature at Oxford who said that. So there is many people who misinterpret Thomas's poems in the context of war. You immediately look for everything in the poem to be about war if you're not careful, and that's one of the dangers. And of course, as we know, you can take Thomas further back to the Icknield Way and see that that poem Rain has its origins before the First World War, and there's many other things to say about it than simply that. And that the hut is a war. It does make it a war poem in a way, because the hut is an army hut in the poem Rain, and that hut is not there in the Icknield Way, so it's not the same. The poem is not the same as the Icknield Way, but there are many similarities with the passage of prose. That also emphasises the fact that frequently Thomas is just seen as a poet, of course, and that we need to think about all the prose as well as another part of his identity. Something to unteach there maybe is that Thomas was a poet, perhaps in some senses. There's some way of teaching whereby you can begin with a series of assumptions about Thomas and then kind of unpick them or move backwards from there. Such as Thomas was a poet, yes, but also a prose writer, but also Thomas was a war poet, yes, but Thomas was a poet made by his friendship with Robert Frost, well, maybe, yes, but Thomas was a modernist, well, maybe, yes, but Thomas was not a modernist, well, yes, maybe, but Thomas was traditional, Thomas was Welsh. You can create a whole list of these. This could be a way of structuring a whole series of classes on him. He was beginning with statements or assumptions and then questioning them, and you could even find lots of critics to provide you with those statements which you can then disagree with, perhaps. And indeed, the memorial stone near here does just call him poet, of course, and then there's a quotation from his prose, just to complicate it. The nature poet one I find is very interesting too. I need to stop soon, 5 minutes, so it's good, nearly at the end. Nature poet, because of course he is, but that can often lead to, I think, some misunderstandings of his work too. You could start to point out that there's towns in his work as well. It's not just about the countryside, as it's often called, even when there's a difference between nature and the countryside, of course. But also there are some interesting cases for Thomas where there's hardly nature as such pursued in any great detail. There's none of the nature teaching that he was talking about earlier. If you looked at In Memoriam, it's just the flowers. It doesn't go into great detail of explaining what they are, and part of the power of the poem probably comes from that simplicity of it. Or the owl, it's just the owl, isn't it? It doesn't go into great detail talking about indeed what type of owl. There's much debate in the owl about whether it's a barn owl or a tawny owl or whatever else. That doesn't necessarily seem that important. So it's not as if Thomas is always trying to be the nature writer who wants to be very specific about what he has seen. He obviously is that in many of his poems, but in other cases, such as the owl actually does have some kind of symbolic significance rather than necessarily just being a poem describing the owl in great detail. And In Memoriam's brevity is part of its power rather than him writing a nature essay about the flowers in the wood. But it's also quite a glib fallback sometimes with talking about Thomas. You just say, oh, he's a nature poet, and his poetry is just about saying how lovely the countryside is, which is true, and yet that's also quite a limiting way of talking about him. And also there's always an assumption, of course, that anything to do with nature is also conservative or old-fashioned, which can also be quite a dangerous trap with Thomas. And then just towards the end, I do want to say about another aspect of Unteaching now, which is the whole world of AI. I have to say, I'm glad that my students actually on the whole have not fallen into using AI when talking about Thomas, because it's all completely wrong. So you've probably heard there's much worries in schools and universities about people now using artificial intelligence to do their work for them. And if you want, you can have great fun going to ChatGPT and putting in questions for yourself, say, what's the meaning of old man, or please tell me about what Alan Stropp's about. And students can cut and paste that and put it straight into their essay, and it won't even be picked up by plagiarism software because it's not stolen from some published work. So this is the great worry. I've even, of course, been at classes at university where they say things like, make sure that use AI, see it as a tool rather than as a problem. Use it to write your own lectures, I've heard people say. And then try using Edward Thomas on ChatGPT, and it comes up with absolute nonsense. So, for instance, it tells you the old man is about an old man sitting by a fire who shares his thoughts about the passage of time and the changes it brings. The poem captures a moment of quiet introspection and highlights the contrast between the vibrancy of youth and the introspective, sometimes melancholy nature of old age. Wow. I can't imagine a more wrong reading of old man. Or even my favourite one, though, is Lob. It began with Lob. It says Lob is like a dog. Your dog? Well, it's a nice name for a dog now. Lob is a dog. It is an essential element to explore deeper philosophical and emotional concerns. The poem is a monologue delivered by a narrator who speaks about his dog called Lob. The narrator reflects on Lob's nature and behaviour, and through this reflection, the poem explores broader themes related to the natural world and the relationship between humans and animals. It's a nice poem, but it's not at all wrong, is it? Even Abelstrop gets completely wrong. It talks about the swallows in Abelstrop. Actually, I've used these as examples to students to say just the words don't use ChatGPT or think that AI is going to write your essay for you because it's all nonsense. Anyway, I'm sorry to end though, but the problem is, the final problem, which is why this gets my nice ending for this, is that sense with Thomas and so many other writers that they are quite negative about school and university and learning, which actually itself can be a challenge to students in the classroom. I teach to Thomas actually often right at the end of their degree and the end of their 3 years, and here we are with Thomas being very negative about the uses of school or university, and here they are having worked hard and now they're going off into the workplace, and you're saying, well, maybe it was all a waste of time. There's so many other texts that I'm doing often on the same course, have the same kind of point of view. I'll put up some of the examples of the books they'll be studying Edward Thomas alongside. So you see, I find exactly the same kind of attitude in Room with a View, where you know that story Lucy had teaching next week actually. Lucy Honeychurch gets the choice in effect between two men, the bookish educated one and the outdoor sporty one, and we know which one she's going to go for. And Wilfred Owen, equally quite negative indeed about school, and the school mistress, or Queen Dodger, Decorumest, as a kind of anti-school poem in a way. Lady Chatterley's Lover, same kind of concept. Brideshead Visited, a university novel, and yet has no interest in what goes on in the classroom, and it's not at all about that. It's about how university is what you do outdoors and outside the classroom with your friends rather than actually any bookish learning. We also do Barbara Finn's Crampton Hobnet, where academics get portrayed as exactly like that schoolmaster in Edward Thomas's fiction, actually, completely. Just a skeleton in a box on a stick. And then moving beyond the Second World War, you can find in these other texts that we do exactly the same kind of negative attitudes about education. And yet, just to end on a more positive note though, my general experience is that Edward Thomas is a wonderful person to teach in the classroom, despite all of that negativity. I think that's also why he's often used in kind of anthologies and introductions to poetry as well, for teaching people about poetry and hopefully about prose. Thomas is often the exemplar, and students really enjoy him. I had essays last year where students actually said how much they loved Thomas. They didn't know anything about him, but they loved him by the end of the course, and that's really what you're aiming for in the end, isn't it? Right, thank you very much.